Thanks, Kevin, for that introduction. I'm, I wanted to tell you a little bit about who I was and what Good Systems is all about, since it's already come up here. And I've always studied emerging technologies in some way, shape, or form. That at one time was the internet, at another time it was social media. Now, of course, it's artificial intelligence. And so the emergence of a research project that UT was very interested in sponsoring was perfect for me. Good Systems is an effort that's now in its 7th year, will sunset at the 8th year next year. And it's been led and by a staff. It was funded actually with university money. We didn't initially have any outside money for this, and our labor was volunteer. There's a group of about 9 faculty who got together and kind of crafted the shape of this effort. Now there's over 100 faculty undertaking different research projects, doing a lot of different things. We're called Good Systems because we're trying to focus on ethics. When that title was presented to the then university president, he said, "Why do you just want to be good? Don't you want to be great?" But we had to kind of remind him of the sort of moral connotations of good. So we're reaching back to the idea that AI can be crafted for good outcomes, and we need to foreground what it takes to actually make AI good. So I've been working with this group, and I've always been interested in cameras. And I was poking around with another researcher looking at different camera installations around UT and different research groups that were using cameras. And we were really interested in how cameras were being used around the state of Texas to monitor floods. We have a lot of disasters here in Texas. Flooding is a real problem. And one fellow offhandedly remarked that now with AI, we can do a lot better predicting where water is going to be, where it's going to go, what's going to flood. And that sort of value added of AI that could monitor flooding really captivated us. And so we began to look around a little bit more closely at cameras as they were being used in the public sector, in particular, state government and city government. And I think we're lucky. One nice thing about Austin is that we talk to the city. The city tries to be accountable, I think, to residents. There are a lot of warts, a lot of flaws, but at least there are processes here by which citizens make their voices known, and the city is actively trying and has actively tried to solicit. Again, it's never been a perfect process, but it's better than in many cities. So we began to work with the city in different ways and gather data from the city. Our team was composed of a lot of graduate students and a few faculty from engineering, from urban planning, and from the School of Information. It's really been a team effort. But as we began to look more closely at how the public sector was using cameras, the really predictable problems come up. Problems of how the public is made aware of what cameras are doing, where the data go, and the extent to which cameras can really intrude on us. What are the limits of privacy? And so we began to dive into kind of the civil liberties end of what cameras meant. And indeed, I vividly remember when I was talking about this with some of the city folks here, they said, "Don't use the word surveillance. Don't use it. We don't use it. It's monitoring." In the meantime, as I was looking at what other cities around the country were doing, they were using the word surveillance, frankly. And I found that about 25 cities, it's not a big number, actually adopted surveillance ordinances. go full circle now, Austin is actually considering adopting a trust ordinance. It's been, the city manager has directed the city to come up with the language for a trust ordinance that is essentially a surveillance ordinance. Very much along the lines of what I have seen in a lot of other cities. So Austin is moving forward on this. I said 25 cities. That's not very many. Not very many cities. We did discover a lot of cities have policies, but a policy is not a law. A policy is unenforceable, it's changeable, it's very negotiable, a lot of wiggle room. That can be good for policy, but it can also be bad for a lot of other things. So this is where our team has sort of been, and what some of our thinking was as we moved toward looking at surveillance cameras and how the public sector is using cameras. I threw together the language that was adopted here in order to move this Trust Act forward. So what I want to talk about today has actually been eclipsed a little bit already by Kevin, because Kevin already gave you all the issues when he went through the litany of the issues that have come before the city, some of the issues that have come before the state. What I simply want to underscore on that point is there are a lot of surveillance cameras in our public life. Many of them you're doubtless already aware of. I'm not even going to mention the ones that you carry around, your phone, and the ones that you may have in your house, your smart speaker device or your Ring camera, and so forth. I'm really interested in what public sector cameras are doing. And then I just want to complicate how we think about that a little bit and get you to think more about the use of cameras in different situations, like a war situation or an emergency situation. We have a lot of emergencies in this country right now, and I think that's a very deliberate use of an important term that we need to pay more attention to. And I'm just going to give you some examples of some of the data aggregation developments. And then I'd like to kind of wrap up, frankly, where Hugh left off with urging us to think a little bit more about control over data, and how we as people can be actively involved in crafting what we want from these technologies and the uses of these technologies. So let's take a look at some of these systems. This is actually our own fire department here in Austin. Almost every city unit in Austin has some kind of surveillance camera installation. Fire uses them. There are some really good uses here, right? Drone cameras can fly over a burning building and tell firefighters with an infrared camera where you should go in order to fight that fire. Extremely functional uses. One example of the fire department that the fire department shared with me that gave them pause was when they were monitoring George Floyd protests in the city of Austin. It's a time-honored tradition to start fires at protests. It is, in this country and in many other countries too. They were worried that there would be a fire. They wanted to be prepared. So they had drones, and they were sharing that with the police department. That made them a little uncomfortable. A lot of us are very familiar with traffic cameras. These are easy to see. They're easy to ignore. We have a lot of them all over Austin, and indeed now most major cities in this country have a lot of traffic cameras. There are some other kinds of cameras. The older CCTV cameras one sees in a lot of European cities and some American cities too. Halo cameras are 360-degree cameras, often linked to police department monitoring, and they're often deployed downtown. And all of these cameras have their own niche in cities, in city units. This, for example, is a control room that you've probably never seen. It was downtown, I think it's still there. These traffic cameras are actually live monitored. Hard to believe that they are here. And Austin Mobility, our transportation company, doesn't record anything. They don't want to get into the issue of having too much data. They don't want to have data that caught a traffic accident that you want the footage from. They just don't want to go there. Sort of an interesting aspect to how a city manages these kinds of images. But every city wants these kinds of cameras, and you probably want them too, so that you can be rerouted or alerted when there's some traffic problem. So there's a real functional aspect to this. One thing that we discovered, which I had never heard of before, was that we have a lot of cameras in the library in this city, and indeed most major cities have a lot of cameras. I did this project 2 years ago. There may be more cameras, but we have 450 cameras in our library system. More than half of them are in the downtown library. And when we talk to people working in the library and we talk to library users, there was an interesting and conflicted perspective on these cameras. They make some people feel very secure. The library staff really want to feel safe, and they want a safe environment as well. Nobody's going to come to the library if it's not safe. And they believe that the cameras enhance security, that it enhances safety. Now, bear in mind, cameras are reactive, right? They're not proactive. They capture something, but the thing has already happened, what they capture. You can follow up, maybe, but they're reactive. They're not going to prevent something from happening. This is their control center in the lower floor of the library. And you probably never even noticed, the library actually has security people roaming around. What we learned is that when there is something that goes wrong in the library, people don't turn to the cameras. They turn to people. They turn to the people who can go to the problem immediately and try to resolve it. It makes a lot of sense, but it was also sort of interesting in that we have all these cameras, but they don't really prevent a lot of, things from happening there. They can be used sometimes to follow up if there's somebody who creates problems repeatedly. But it's a conflicted public space. And this sort of conflicted public space actually exists across a lot of different camera uses for the city. People at the library, using the library, people working, they all want the library to be trusted. They want it to be open. They want it to be a welcoming space. But they do feel that they need these cameras in order to actually make that happen. Those of you who've been to this library, you probably never even noticed the cameras. They don't, because by the same token, they don't want you to feel like Big Brother is there. And they said that to us. So it's, again, kind of a conflicted space. This is not a camera. This is another contentious urban technology, though. And I wanted to at least include it, if only because it is another technology that a lot of people object to. This is called ShotSpotter. It detects sounds that resemble gunshots, basically. And police say that this will help them identify where guns are being fired so that they can go there quickly and remediate in some way, shape, or form. There is a lot of research that suggests these are not very good, that they mistake a lot of other sounds for gunshots. And that's one reason why it's so contentious. Another reason is the areas that police typically want to deploy ShotSpotter. The idea being that if they put them in areas where they think crime is going on and they hear cars backfiring or these sounds that seem like gunfire, there's going to be a greater police presence that may not indeed be warranted. In any case, I include it here because it's a very contentious technology. The technology that we've spent a lot of time on most recently are drones. This may be unfortunate because everybody is kind of thinking about drones now in the context of the wars that are being fought globally. When we first started hearing about drone cameras in the city context, as I said earlier, almost every city unit is using some kind of drone because they're really useful. Again, Good Systems is looking for some of the good uses here. A drone with a camera. I already gave you the firefighting example. A drone with a camera can inspect infrastructure. Really, it can go up a pole and look at the quality of a line. It can go underneath something much more easily than a person could. There's a lot of advantages to having drone cameras, but they're right now also being weaponized in so many ways. The Ukraine war is only one. The Iran war, of course, is going on, but drones have actually been quietly contentious in the public sector for quite some time. I found this study from 6 years ago that was looking at the use of drones by public safety agencies. And they were already worried about other people using drones for malicious attacks. So there's always been kind of a weaponization quality to drone cameras. And I think from a public perspective, all of you, maybe when you think of drone cameras, you're thinking about war as well. Well, we were really interested in complicating what these technologies were and how they functioned. And of course, you already heard a little bit about, and indeed it was hard to miss in the news, the difficulty that Anthropic and the Pentagon have been having. Anthropic seems to be taking the high road and saying we're not going to design AI to be used with data gathering techniques, including cameras, that can be used for mass domestic surveillance, or that could be used for autonomous killing, referring to killing without a human, so-called human in the loop. And the Pentagon, this was quite a strong battle between one of the largest and most powerful tech companies and the Pentagon. I think some people may think it's settled. I don't think it is. I don't think it's played out. But fundamentally, I think that the whole who's right here has really deflected attention from a more important question. Where should governance be? Do you really want to trust the government on this? Do you really want to trust big tech on this? By complicating this, what I'm beginning to try to suggest is we need to figure out ways that we can exercise a little bit more control over that. We the people, but the sovereign power that people can actually exercise in a lot of different ways, whether it's by being thoughtful in a forum like this, or whether it's airing some of the ways that technology could actually be improved so that there is always a human in the loop, so that open source technology is used prominently. So this government versus corporation issue, I think, it's a canard, it's a red herring, and I don't think we should fall for it, frankly. I think there's something better out here. And I don't even think that congressional guardrails, as one of our former Air Force secretaries said, I don't even think that that's really a solution to this. I don't think there's a hero here. So it's more complicated than that. And we need to get complicated in terms of understanding what we want and what's acceptable to us. And that is actually what some of our research tries to do. Now, Kevin gave you this big buildup about numbers and data and hard data. And I really wasn't going to share a whole lot of data with you. But we've been looking and asking people about norms associated with these new technologies. There's a problem there. If you don't know about drone cameras, if you don't know about automated license plate readers, ALPR, can you really have an opinion? Hard. It's a hard issue. But we are trying to do this. And actually, we also felt that norms are highly local. They're context dependent. The norms, perhaps, for what's acceptable in Austin isn't the same as what's acceptable in Houston or Waco or Chicago or New York. So we devised a study localized to Austin this time. We'd like to take it elsewhere, but right now we have some data from Austin. And we basically asked people about how acceptable it is to use ALPRs and drones. We first explained those technologies and actually included photos and scenarios of how they're used. So there was a little educational component to our survey. And then we asked people, well, is it acceptable to use a drone camera for this reason, for that reason? And does it matter who's using it as well? Trying to get beyond this issue of good, bad, good drone, bad drone. And I know you can't see this, the lighting isn't quite right, but just to walk you through the top line here. On the left, we ask people about the fire department, the police department, transportation, schools, and since we have a municipal energy unit here, we asked about that. And then we asked them how acceptable it would be to use these technologies for different purposes. And that's what the colored bars are here. I know you can't read it. This is, it's very blurry in here. But the takeaway here is in every one of them, the red line is on top. The purpose that the red line refers to are emergencies. What this is really telling us is that people are okay with these technologies to fight that fire, to detect that flood, to find the survivor of this disaster. These emergency uses, no matter who was using the technology, those were things that people were okay with. The bottom line, the light line, were routine surveillance exercises. This is typically what automated license plate readers are. They are set up in a neighborhood, they just sit there and they watch. They watch comings and goings, they just sit there. And people were not happy about that. They felt that that was too intrusive. So this issue of a purpose emerged in our data as a really core component to coming up with what people really want to use these technologies for. And the context was a little bit different depending on the who was behind it. We found that some types of actors, like the fire department, people were far more accepting of their use of these technologies than they were the police using these technologies. So our conclusion was that context is really important. And this, again, it gets complicated because that means we can't say, no, we don't want ALPRs ever for any purpose. Because some people would approve of that in the right circumstances. So context, again, is important. The third thing I wanted to mention a little bit has to do with the data that all of these technologies yield. Of course, I don't think anybody who's been paying attention to the news over this summer is unaware of the extent to which ICE has been gathering a lot of different data, meshing that data, and creating profiles of people. But it isn't tracking only immigrants, of course, it's tracking everybody. And we saw some pretty vivid evidence of that in Minneapolis. And indeed, I've been fascinated by looking at what kinds of data were gathered in Minneapolis and the uses of that data. And once you start kind of peeling the surface back from the systems that cities and that companies have developed, and that certain federal and increasingly state and local offices use, you find that indeed there is a vibrant data market that is intent on meshing a lot of data sets in order to get a very detailed set of profiles of regions and of people. And I thought that this in particular was so interesting because FUSIS, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, is being marketed in small towns, small cities, that on the face of it, you wouldn't even think need these kinds of systems. But indeed, they convinced cities and continue to convince cities to allow individual cameras, private and public cameras, to be networked, basically. And then they can be gathered, all the data can converge into maps with opportunities to query the data. And this particular system is extremely granular in what it can apprehend. I was also looking for better statistics, and I'll offer you two observations. First of all, under the Trump administration, federal data sets are disappearing. Sometimes they come back, but they're not as available as they used to be. So in a way, I'm embarrassed that the statistics I have are from 2020, but that's all I could find. But the statistical data, even in 2020, is really quite striking. Body-worn cameras, there are pros and cons to body-worn cameras, are used in almost all the police departments of larger cities, cities of Austin's size and bigger. Almost all of them don't follow Austin's example. Almost all of them do use license plate readers. For almost half of them use facial recognition in some way, shape, or form. I would add that in some cities that have these surveillance ordinances, facial recognition is not allowed. And some states and cities have disallowed facial recognition. Austin has disallowed facial recognition. When you actually go into the data, these are just the city sizes here, from small on the bottom to large on the top. Even some smaller cities are using things like shot spotters, and they're using license plate readers. There's been a normalization, I think, of these technologies across all of these different departments. And what was striking to us is the extent to which terms like emergency and security emerge here. Defense. Sometimes we need to defend ourselves. And those are almost used as a kind of cover for normalizing surveillance. Everybody wants to be safe. Nobody in this room would disagree that you want to be safe. But when safety is offered as a corollary to these systems, it kind of becomes hard to argue in a way. And I think part of where I'd like us to end up here is on being very careful about what we're talking about and what we mean about safety and security, and what is truly an emergency that prompts us to approve of these kinds of technologies. Now we have seen that ICE is using even more advanced systems to gather more data about people, data that other countries, or data products that other countries, like Canada, for example, has banned Clearview. Other countries disallow. Even beyond the use of apparatuses that you might call technology, software is being used. And I was really surprised that even back in 2020, 70% of large cities were using predictive policing, which is a technique that predicts where crimes will be committed and who might commit those crimes. It's never been systematically evaluated, but it has been assessed periodically as yielding very poor results. 92% use social network analysis in order to understand who you are and who you've been with. The problem with all of this is a kind of mission creep that is part of this normalization process, so that a lot of city units are basically authorized, expected to have and to use these technologies. I just pulled up the predictive policing and the social network statistics. They're really remarkably high for cities over 250,000. Very extensive use. And I'm sure this number is higher now because it's from 2020. So, powerful words, safety and emergency. And it puts us, all of us, and the institutions we want to trust on a kind of slippery slope here. And it reminded me a lot of reactions to the Patriot Act. I was recalling that there was only one Senate vote against the Patriot Act back in 2001. And the rationale for that one senator to not vote in favor of the Patriot Act was precisely what we're seeing now. Civil liberties threatened, a lack of checks and balances, and the absence of privacy rights. And that same senator wrote 20 years after the Patriot Act that his observation was that domestic anti-terrorism laws are used predominantly against Black and brown people. That was his assessment. And then we have a long history of doing that in this country. So that brings me back to this issue of safety and emergency use to justify surveillance tech all the time. I heard it in the library. I heard it with the fire department. We hear it routinely from the police department. Yet it's very difficult to argue against that. We all want to be safe. So I think we need to think more in a more focused way, in a clear way, about control and how we want data to be deployed, how we want the data that technologies yield to be shared or not shared, and what we might do in order to productively use data without violating civil liberties. Some of our technical folks on our project are actually looking at data models using a technique called unlearning in order to identify data that can be used to train models, but then disappear from the model so that the actual granular data is gone. It's unlearned. Very interesting technique. I think we'll all hear about more. So the real lesson here is, to me at least, is the importance of more robust democratic structures. And I'm really glad you're going to hear from some of the commissioners for Austin a little bit later, because that is part of the local democratic structure here, the structure that can give us a little bit more transparency and a sense of what we really want from these systems and how we can kind of move from where we are now to something a little bit better.
Let's give that a
That's
short
right.